Okay, so Module 12. So pull down your lesson files here. I've got a template to work with. Pull these down into your Lesson 12 folder. Okay, we can get rid of the _ Mac OS 10 if you are on a Windows machine. Otherwise, you'll see a folder called Lesson Files. That's fine. Cool. So we should have 3 items: index, images, and a CSS. So what we'll do here. Open the whole folder in your code editor. Okay, fire this up in a browser of some variety. Doesn't matter. Okay, so it should look kind of like this, silly putty. So largely unstyled document. Always, 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 before we do any CSS, yes, validate. So let's go ahead. Don't take my word for it. Please check the HTML. Is it any good? No. Bad times. So fix those HTML errors. Revalidate it, and get it going. I'll give you a couple minutes to sort it out. Fix Scott's bad HTML. I should have put a blink tag in there.
Did someone really use it?
Use what? Blink?
Yeah.
I haven't seen the blink one for a while, to be honest. Yeah, that one, that's a particular aberration. Hasn't been I haven't seen anyone dust that one off yet, but.
What was that originally for?
Yeah, it was really obnoxious.
Yeah. It was just curious if there was a reason for this rage on Facebook or just random.
I think every now and then you just have to remind people, like, because like HTML, it's starting to get to be a pretty vast technology, right? But there's reasons why we deprecate certain elements, and that means you shouldn't be using them, right? Like it's actually, there's a reason why we're trying to phase them out, right? And yeah, also, I mean, if you're graduating from this program, I want to make sure that everyone coming out of the program is producing modern HTML. It's a source of personal pride, I guess. But it's to your benefit to be able to produce modern markup, right? All right, so the first mistake is, of course, line 24, there was a missing end tag for H3. So with the validator, sometimes one mistake can perpetuate a multitude of mistakes, right? So you, first of all, fix the first error at the top of the list, save the template, check it again. Don't try and fix all 12 errors, because sometimes one error can actually create a false positive or more, right? It can a broken open empty element will look at all the rest of the elements as if they're inside of that element, and it will basically create these errors. So didn't like that refresh. All right, that's fine. Right, so that just fixing that one problem addressed 2 errors in the validator. Right, because it was looking at the rest of the page as if it was part of that H3 because it was unclosed. So just fix the 1 error and off you go. Cool. All right, so that's it. Check. Step 1. We have now valid HTML. We can now proceed with confidence to our CSS, or if we're doing any JavaScript, any client-side scripting, we can do that without being nervous about a broken DOM, right? You don't want, no one likes a broken DOM. Cool. Normalize your CSS. Absolutely, right? Whether you're using a Bootstrap, a framework, whatever, it's good practice. Usually if you're using a framework like Bootstrap, or you're using Boilerplate or something like that, it's already baked in. But sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're going to be building utilities from scratch, right? So I already have in the CSS. I have. Oh no, I don't have a normalize. Go and get the normalize. Pull it down. So go to your browser. We'll pull down a. Pull down version 7. Control S for save. Save as. Put it in the CSS folder. Right? If you type normalize.css into your search bar, that will be the first hit that comes up. So save normalize into that CSS folder here. And let's bolt that on. This is particularly important to normalize if we're doing things like transitions or transforms, right? Or translates or skews or anything like that. If there are any kind of slight variations in the way browsers are going to render these elements, and we need any amount of precision, it's really important that we kind of level the playing field, get all the browsers rendering just the same. So that's a really important step. All right, let's bolt on our step 3. Let's get the external CSS. It's kind of sort of pre-built. Let's bolt that on. And if we reload the page, you'll know normalize works because you should see a change in the font face. Well, actually that's not true. That's the that would be the style sheet that the custom style sheet. Actually, normalize doesn't do much except it used to change the font to a sans serif. Now it just gets rid of. You'll see it eliminates the page margins. All right, so if everything's working, you should see the page should look like this with, oops. Awesome. Cool. So I'll walk you through the markup, really no big deal. I've got a page level container, div ID container. I've got a header with a primary heading. I've strongly emphasized the text inside the strong, I've even emphasized text inside a strong element. You can do that. So that's my primary heading, my subheading, and I would put global navigation here just to show you that very often, if you have a nav element in the header in your template, that implies global navigation. It's good practice to put in there. And then, of course, I have a number of sections. So I have a section for transforms. So H2 transforms. So the different types of transforms we'll do will be in that section. And then we break out into, again, where'd my other section go? Oh, and then we're going to break into transitions in another section of the document. Then we close out with a page level footer. Close the, and actually this should say, we should put a comment in here to be, nope, that's not what I want. ID container for good practice, since there's we're quite a ways from the beginning of that up here, and that's it. So that's our markup. All right, let's take a look at styles. Okay, so I've got on the HTML I've doubled the font size. I'm using font shorthand, so I've doubled the font size, or not doubled, 1.5 times. Slash the line height is now 1.4 for leading, for line spacing, and I just converted it to a sans serif face. So that is on the root element, so that inherits throughout the whole document. No tricks there. Okay, what we're going to do here now is apply a gradient to the body of the page. So I want you to point your browser over to this URL here. And this is the CSS gradient generator. If you're a Chrome or a Firefox fan, if you're using those either browsers for development, I'll draw your attention to the extensions. So in ColorZilla 2.0 is pretty cool. And you can use this, of course, for a color picker. You can analyze the colors so you can get a sense of what the palette is on the page. But it also kind of gives you a Photoshop style color picker, right? Which is pretty cool. Gives you HSL or HSV values, RGB values, outputs the hexadecimal values, right? Pretty cool. And you can add it to a and then you can see you've got if you want to remember colors you're using in a design, it'll add them to the palette. It's a neat little, I think it's important to use sparingly, but use decent browser extensions. You don't want to overdo it, but developing with the browser is getting pretty good these days. Cool. So let's so the ColorZilla. Let's go to the gradient generator. We're going to generate a gradient that'll go from top to bottom. So here's the on top here is the alpha channel, so the opacity. Here is the color stop, so I can move these, and you can see the how that affects the way the page is rendered. It's cool. Creating a gradient, remember, is more a visual. And you can drag these color stops away and they'll just disappear. I just want a smooth gradient from top to bottom. Going from a darker blue to a lighter blue is fine. And we can triple click isn't working. Go. Whatever. All right. So select all this code, copy that, and this will show us the code for the generator. We're going to put this on the body element. That's cool. Just because you've generated the code elsewhere, though, of course, the formatting may not be great. Take pride in your code. Make sure to format it properly. Notice we're almost at the point in time now where we're generating a linear gradient. It's the background property or background image. Pretty soon the day will come when all I have to do is just type that. Right? I don't need all this other stuff. This is for, and here's the, this is the thing with standards, right? Like so, before the W3C, you know, kind of standardized this syntax, we had WebKit. So those look pretty similar actually. WebKit and Mozilla. But different than two bottom. So it's kind of normalizing. Also, if you have an older version of like 9 or lower of IE, you need to use a very horrible proprietary filter, right? You know, or you don't have to. You could get rid of that and just deal with put a background color in. That's fine, right? And say, well, if they don't get a gradient, they don't get a gradient. Why bother punishing their bandwidth with all that stuff? That's cool. Save that on the body element. And you should see that gradient applies. Cool. All right. Cool. Step 3. Step 4, image replacement. I want to show you an interesting topic here. So copy this URL. We'll head over to csstricks.com. Image replacement. So this is called the Image Replacement Museum because this was kind of a really a series of different what we call CSS hacks, whereby let's just say you had a logo for a company and you wanted the benefit of using an H1 for that company name, but you didn't want to render that text at all. You wanted to simply have the word marker or the logo as an image, maybe it was a PNG or SVG or whatever, but you wanted to sort of hide the H1. So the image replacement techniques evolved over time because in so hiding the H1 text and just using a background image, say for a corporate logo, you would sometimes create accessibility issues. You know, if you said display none to the H1, well then it wouldn't read out in a screen reader. So there were a number of different methods that you can see. You can go back in time and see the different ways we used to do this, right? A lot of them involved kind of hacks to do this. So we'll go up here to the most recent way of doing things, which is called Hh5 Boilerplate, right? So what we do is you put in on the, here I'll zoom this up. Boilerplate actually has a class called Visually Hidden, right? So you put that class on the element that you want to swap out with an image rather than text, and then you this text here hides or clips the text itself so it's not visible, and then we can go ahead and put an image on there. Okay, so that's and I'll show you an even simpler method. So what we'll do is here we'll take a look at, if you take a look at the markup. Oops. Here, so here we have an H1. Inside the H1 is a strong element, right? So what we'll do is we'll put the background image on the H1, right? And then what I'll do is I'll set the strong element to visibility, not display none, but visibility hidden, right? So that will So rather than, if you're in a screen reader capacity, visually it may be hidden, but hopefully it will be read aloud. So this is what we'll do here. So keep this markup in your mind here. So there's a strong inside an H1. So let's go ahead to the H1 here. And I want to add a background image. Actually, we'll use the background property. No, we'll use background image just to split it up. Background image. I'll say URL. And there's our silly putty there. So we'll head up one directory. All right, I don't need to have one. No, we're okay. Oh yeah, up one directory from the CSS. Images. Apply the background image to the H1. Obviously no good, so I want to size the H1 so it matches the image perfectly. So take a look at the image here. Is a 250 by 160 dimension, so I'll size the H1 just to match that. That, of course, hides, now that the H1 here, I inspect that, you'll see that, of course, the blue is the image size here, 250 by 160. So the other repeat, you can set the background repeat, and it might be helpful for rendering speed to also address that and say background repeat. No repeat. Okay. So now, of course, we want to conceal this. I don't need that text. I want it there in my markup for accessibility reasons, for screen readers, for in case images don't load, right? That could happen, or people might have images turned off to speed up browsing, or to save a bandwidth, for whatever reasons, right? So let's go ahead in the header H1 strong here, and we'll set the visibility to hidden. Image replacement. So you need to be careful with that. Could we just use an SVG? I suppose you could, and include these as real letters. You could. It's important, though, when you're dealing with things like mastheads or headers, you want to have primary headings, and you want to put, like, I want silly putty in an H1. That's really important. But I do want, from a user's perspective, I do want them to see this. I don't want them to see the text. I want them to see the word mark, right? But it's an interesting, that's certainly an interesting read to look at some of the challenges inherent in swapping out images for text, right? It's been an ongoing challenge. It's by no means resolved, but we're certainly a lot closer. All right, Chewy Font. Yeah, let's go and pull down Google's Chewy Font, which is kind of like silly putty, sort of, kind of. And we'll search up Chewy. There we go. Add this. What I'll do is I'll add this as an add import. So go ahead and copy the add import from the code that's generated. We don't want the style element. I mean, you could put that in your HTML, but remember the style tag is an HTML tag. Sometimes I see people do that. They'll jam style tags into their CSS and wonder what's going on. Now, if we're going to do an add import, it needs to be in the top of your CSS rule. You can't put an add import midway or at the bottom after a series of CSS rules. It's unlikely it's going to work. Okay, so, and this is true. From time to time, you may actually be importing other files, like other CSS files as well. So this needs to go first. It's a dependency, right? We're going to refer, if we're going to pull it, have that font ready to go, right? Then we need to make sure we have that available to us before we start referring to family Chewy. So remember, look at the API, the way the API works here. In this case, it's just calling googleapis.com/CSS, and the URL parameter just passes along the family value, which is Chewy, capital C. We use the same thing. Okay, so let's go here. And I'll use a web safer font. I'll say impact. So this font service fails. Fall back to something that is likely to be installed on someone's machine. That's a very, very common kind of display font. And then failing that, of course, just a general classification. Okay, now we're going to go get into transforms. So if we take a look at our markup here, we have a section with the ID transform. So I'm going to use this as my to specify in my selectors to narrow down the headings inside this part of the document. So I'm going to leverage that ID here. Okay, so we're going to do transforms H3 nth of type. So the second type, second H3 inside the element with the ID transform, right? So that would be that one. So this would be, where's our second? There's our applying a transform origin. So that would be this one we're styling right here. That's the second one inside there. That's what that means. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Cool. So controlling the origin of the transform. So if we're going to transform something, so we're going to rotate it, we're going to shift it somewhere, offset it somewhere, do something positionally with it, we need a point of reference on that element with which to change around with respect to, right? So if, say, for example, if I'm going to say I have a square here, right, and I want to rotate that 90 degrees, well, that will look very different if I rotate it here rather than I rotate it from the center, right? That will really affect where it ultimately is positioned on the page. If I rotate it from here, you know, and down here, it could be down here, right? But if the transform origin is in the center, and I rotate it, well, of course, that means it's going to end up here. Two very different results. So this is what that syntax looks like. First of all, we'll set this to a display inline block. I'm going to change the I'll change the background to white. Now you can see that indeed there we go. So there we are indeed, we'll add a padding on it. 0.25 of the text size, M. Okay. Now we know we're certainly targeting the right one, and the transform origin looks like this. Transform dash origin, and then we plot in. You want the dead center of it. Then we go X, Y. Okay. You can use keyframes, or sorry, keyframes. You can use keywords like center or top left if you want, or pixels, or any value you want. But essentially, what you're doing when you're plotting this out is you're saying, if I'm going to do any kind of transforming on this, that is the point of origin for which I'm going to operate, right? Particularly important if we're doing something like a rotation. Okay, so the next one, let's translate the element itself. So the third one, H3 nth of type. So this will be the following one. I'll copy this code here. Yeah. So how would I, instead of repeating that code, where would I put that?
Transform H3 and that's it.
Yeah. I like the way you're thinking. So let's reduce let's dry. Oops, did I collapse that? I did. I collapsed that. And we'll trumpet where we need to. Okay. So let's go here. Good suggestion. Transforms H3. And that would allow me to get rid of that, get rid of that. Okay. Translate the element. Okay, so let's go. Transform is the property. And we're going to say translate X, and we'll say 200px. And over it goes. Okay? You'll notice that the space that it otherwise occupied is still reserved for it. So the way it's rendered, the page renders as if it was still sitting there. Okay. We can then, of course, translate on the other axis. Transform say 100px. Remember, that's going to move it down. Oops, did I not save? Nope. What did I do? I broke something. Oh, I misspelled it. That'll do it. But of course, in so doing, I've overwritten the transform property. Right? So now it's only transforming vertically instead of horizontally. If I want them both, then I have to do something a little different. So I say transform, and then I say translate, and then I would say 200 px, comma 100 px. That will allow me to, because of the CSS cascade, I can't specify them both like that. And now I'll get them both working. So it depends. Are you looking to translate this thing just horizontally, just vertically, or both? Okay. I could do just one direction and just put 0 in here if I wanted. Whatever floats your boat. Translate. Cool. Scale the element. All right. This would be H3 nth of type 4. So the fourth H3 inside the transforms section. We'll use the transform property again, and this time it is scale x, for example. And we can use a factor, a unitless number factor. There's scaling. Now, notice how when I scaled it twice, part of it went off the page. Right? I've already defined the transform origin as the center of those elements. Right? Now, if I change, here it is. Oh no, it's only on the second one. From origin. 50-50. So let's change the transform origin. And we'll say top left. So now it scales with respect to the top left corner, moving it out this direction. Okay? So that really, the transform origin really does have an impact on how these things, how they scale. We can now also, if you want, I can say transform. What if I wanted to transform it in two directions? I wanted to 3 times the size along vertical. But then, of course, same thing. I've now overwritten the transform property. So if I want to, just like translate, I have to incorporate both of these things. What did I say? X was 2, 3, like so. Now I get them both. Now, in times gone by, this would have been an image, right? That's the benefit to this technology, is that if I need to be manipulating things with real text, I don't impact the usability of my interfaces or my content. This is real text, right? in the past, we would have had to generate a PNG or a GIF out of a bitmap editor and output it and all that kind of thing. And then, geez, if we wanted to change it, well, back to the bitmap editor, generate a new piece of media, fire it up to the server. Pain, right? Not so. Cool. So actually, what I'll do here, since these things are, I don't need these anymore, I'll comment them out. These have no effect any longer because of the combined rule down there, or combined declaration. Skew the element. Skew. Weird. All right. So let's take a look. So skew is kind of like if you can imagine taking something, kind of cranking it sideways, right? Grab one side, grab the other, and just shearing it like this way or that way, right? So you can do that obviously along a horizontal or a vertical axis. So we'll say transform skew, and of course you can do skew along the same vein. Skew x.
Try 91.
Sorry?
Try 91.
91. All right, 91 degrees. Where's my skew? There it is. Right? There it goes. Largely unreadable, but cool all the same. You can do it, right? So in degrees. So we specify that. Let's say let's do something more like I don't know, 5 degrees, so we can actually read the text still, right? Notice how it's leaning. So it's. I would think when I said 5 degrees, it would skew this way, but it goes that way. That's the way the spec was written, right? Then, of course, and the same exact same situation when if you wanted to skew in 2 axes. So if you wanted to skew y, you're going to that's fine, but you're going to overwrite the transform property again. So we have to do the similar thing. So there's the y vertical axis skewing. If we want to do them, it's like transform skew, just the skew property, 5 degrees, and as such. Comment that out, show you that that's not necessary anymore. They're both there like that. Okay. Notice that the default transform origin is 50-50. It's in the middle of the element. Yeah, question?
If we put minus in there, it would skew in a little bit.
Yep. Yeah, good point. I should have said you could put a negative value in there. Not everything you can put a negative value in, obviously. Yeah. Cool. All right, rotating the element. Actually, it's 3 o'clock. I should give you a break. Let's take a break. Go and get yourself a coffee or whatever you want. And we'll come back. We'll look at rotating and then combining transforms. And then we'll get into the more exciting and transitions, which work with, obviously, with transforms. Okay. Cool. Take a breather. I'll put my screencast on pause. All right, rotation. Let's take a look at rotating an element, what that looks like. H3 nth of type 6. And we rotate X, and we can say 10 degrees, no space between the 10 and the DEG. Okay, so in effect, try and rotate that a little bit further. Let's go 45 degrees. Looks like it's squashed, right? Now what's missing here is the perspective, right? Remember, this is in a two-dimensional context, not in 3D. If it was in a three-dimensional context, right, as you rotated it backwards, so here would be it would look, you know, as you rotated it backwards, it would kind of look like this, right? In 3D. But this is 2 dimensions, so it just kind of looks like it's squashed. So that's fine. We could rotate, transform, rotate the other way as well. Oops, not skewed. We can rotate Y, where the axis would be along through it vertically, right? Let's try this. Yeah, I'll try it. I don't know. And if you rotate it 90 degrees, we should have gonzo. It's not aligned because it's truly two-dimensional, right? So, cool. So of course then, if we wanted to, we can also do this. Transform, rotate, rotate Z. You say 20 degrees. Right? So now you imagine the Z-axis going right through it, like this. So as you stuck a pencil in it and start spinning it around. You can also, if you leave off the Z, it's assumed. Then the axis is right through the middle, right? You can have a negative value on that as well if you want. Yeah, so these ones would be, again, we've overwritten those here with the transform, so this would be the only one that applies. Cool. Combining the transforms. If you have, oh, let's go take a look at the page here. So combining transform. So if you have an element that you want to apply a number of different transformations to, you can do it with one in short form. So we can do, let's do this. Let's say transform. And I can do a space-separated list of transformations. So let's say we want to scale the thing 3 times. Let's translate it along the x-axis, maybe, I don't know, 30 pixels. Let's translate it along the y-axis, I don't know, 50 pixels. And let's also rotate it 10 degrees. How come I lost my... These can be in any order. Now, of course, if all of this is based on the transform origin being in the center of the element, right? That's why even that's why it's kind of off. If I change the, I could change the transform origin. I can set it to, let's say, whoops, I need that top left. Right, quite a different result. So that means this, now I'm treating this point as my reference point, not the center of the element. Pretty cool. All right, so all of these transforms, the benefit to this is we no longer need to use vendor prefixes. We used to have to do things like that, or things for Mozilla. We used to do things like this for Opera. We used to have to do things like that for Microsoft, and for Safari and Chrome, you may see things like this from time to time, right? For the most part, yeah, well, certainly the transform CSS transforms no longer require that. The browsers have now kind of moved beyond vendor-specific syntax, so that's great. You know, it used to be a lot of work to do this and get it to work reliably across different platforms. No longer. You guys live in very cool times in terms of like browsers are amazing and very consistent, reliable pieces of software, no matter where you go. You know, I mean, I even downloaded Opera Mini on my phone the other day. It works. It's pretty good. I mean, the support for CSS on an obscure browser on my phone is pretty good. I'm like, that's amazing. That's amazing. Well,
when you go to can I use Opera Mini,
it does.
Always red.
That one, yeah, that one's. But if that's the bottom of the barrel, that's pretty good, right? Like, because it supports enough of them that it's not going to break the browsing experience on the web. Like, things are usable on a if they're usable on something obscure like that, the rest of the web's pretty good. So anyway, it's fun. So cool, transitions. So transitions are whereby we can control how a visual property of a CSS element can change over time. So we can control the animation curve, so whether it happens very quickly, whether it's slowly, whether it accelerates into the property or decelerates into it, or a combination thereof. So we can control that change from one visual property to another and control it over time, possibly on some sort of interactive event. So a lot of times you're going to see this on things like hover events for navigation or other things like that. So transitions give us a whole lot of control over how we can add things like transforms for subtle interaction, right? And I maintain subtle. So hitting people over the head with this stuff is considered to be bad practice now, but it can add a lot of it can just breathe a little bit of life into your apps if you use this with a little bit of care. So look at the markup. So we're going to use the ID selector ID transitions H3. So we'll look in the code. So now we're going down here, and we're going to only be targeting H3s inside this section here. Okay. Nope, I don't want to get rid of that. Cool. All right, so first of all, let's set up our transitions. Actually, before we do that, we'll do some common, we'll reduce our code and we'll set the transitions, H3s. And we'll set these all to display inline blocks. So they behave like a box, but they sit side by each on a line. We'll set the background. I'll use yellow. That might be a bit hard on the eyes. Let's use light. Light green. We'll do something a little less hard on the eyes here, just so we can see that they're quite different from the other ones here. Cool. I gotta move this thing. This is in the way. Let's move this thing out. Let's translate it Y. Let's go negative 50 pixels. Let's go up. There we go. Move this crazy thing out of the road. Cool. So we're going to look at the first H3 inside the transitions section. Now, the thing, when you're setting up a transition, you define how those changes over time will transpire on the event, on the element itself. So you don't put that in a say in a hover or some sort of other pseudo class that controls like interaction. You put it, you say if you look at the element on its own and say if this such and such a property is to change, animate it over time, and then when you do a hover, you just change that property, and then that definition for how that is to occur over time is sitting there waiting on the kind of the base description or base styles for that element. Okay. So for example, let's say for this thing we're going to set the transition property, and that transition property we'll use will be background dash color. So this means that if there's a change to background color for the first H3 inside the element with ID transitions, being very specific, if background color changes, it will transition. It won't just snap over like that. There will be some sort of change over time. So how we now need to say, okay, over how long a period of time will the background color, if it changed, will it take to change? Right? So then we use transition duration. Let's say 1.0 seconds. Okay? So that's fine, but it doesn't do anything, nor should it. Because all we're saying is, if the background color of this thing changes, change it from one color to another over a period of 1 second. But it's not changed, so it just sits there. But it knows if that ever were to occur. So let's take a look and say, we'll take the same element here, and on hover, we'll change the background color. So in the hover here, we'll just simply say, so right now it's green, we'll say background, oops, I got to spell it right, background color. We'll make sure it's unmistakable. Now all I'm saying is on hover for this event, or for this element, change it to yellow. Notice on the hover, there's no information whatsoever about how long that's to take place. Now the neat thing about this is, when you mouse out, so when the hover is no longer hovering, that transition's still in effect. Because what's happening is this property is still on the base, still on the element. That's part of the visual property of the element. So if it's the element's now yellow, so you mouse out, right? It goes back to light green. So it's like, oh, well, the background property has changed. So let's transition that over 1 second. So you kind of get a 2-for-1 there. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, now, something to note, don't do this, but just watch me do it. If I was to take these two here, the transition duration and the transition property, and I was to put them on the hover here, right? That means this transition is only true on the element when it's being hovered. I'll show you the difference. So when I hover, it'll change and do that transition. But when I mouse out, it'll be instant. Because I've moused out, that hover is no longer the case, so there's no transition property there. You see what I mean? You see the difference there? So, that's not to say maybe that's the effect you want. I don't know. So generally speaking, if you're going to do a transition, you're going to want to define that not on the interactive state or on the pseudo class, but put it on the style, the base style for the element. So what property you're going to transition and how long that is going to take over time. So this is cool. Let's copy the background color here. Let's set the no, let's set it. Okay, let's do the background color. We'll do the transition duration again. You can change that, change it to a different value. Let's do it over maybe 2 seconds. And if we want to, for whatever reason, transition delay, let's say 0.5 seconds. You can also use milliseconds if you want. Of course, now on hover of this second one, we need to define some other background color. Sure, orange-red. Notice the delay on that hover is also on mouse out. So when the hover is no longer true, it will delay that transition. Anytime there's a change in the color, delay it by 5.5 seconds. Like why would I want to do that? That kind of makes the app almost unresponsive. Well, it depends on what you're doing. That may come into play. There may be a reason why you want. There may be something else going on in the page in an interactive fashion that you may want to hold on to that. So we can change the so delay, next. Transition velocity. Okay, so let's we'll try a different property to change. So on the third H3 inside the transition section. This is really nice. I really like the way they walk you, they step you through the DOM with your selector. I think that's really friendly. I haven't seen an editor do that yet, so tip of the hat to Microsoft for that. That's kind of cool. So let's here change. Let's set the positioning of this element. We'll set it to position relative. This means I can then set the position of this relative to where it was sitting, and I can animate that over time. So I could maybe set, position left, I can set the left position of it to, I don't know, 100 pixels, 200 pixels, whatever. So let's go. So let's set our transition property now. Transition dash property. And let's set it to left. So anytime the left value of this element changes, animate it. Transition duration, let's just say, I don't know, 1.5 seconds. Let's leave the timing function off for a second. And on hover, so this element is now position relative. It's not position static anymore, right? So position relative, I now have the ability to kind of move it around, offset it from where it sits. So let's set the left of this element to 100 pixels, right? So let's bump it over. So this is cool. So if I mouse over it, it moves position relative left 100 pixels on hover. That's fine. But the problem is that it doesn't have anything to animate it from. So I've set it to left 100 pixels, but it actually doesn't have a reference point to start from, right? So what I actually have to set is in here, set the originating. So to start with, let's set left to 0. Now that doesn't change it. It still sits where it sits. But now this transition, now the transition can say, oh, so transition it from 0 to 100 over 1.5 seconds. Now there are different ways that you can get the transition to behave. So for example, we can say, and this is a long property, it's called transition timing function. And we can say ease dash in, ease out, or ease in out. What does that mean? So let's just say ease in. So that means it'll slowly accelerate. So it'll sort of ease into the transition and then accelerate, which would stop, right? Or we can do the opposite, which is ease out. So it depends. It really depends on the kind of feel of your It's a kind of a, you're kind of building in some character, some interactive character. So easing out, it starts quick, and then it slows down as it gets to its destination, right? The default, if we don't do anything, is ease in out. So if I don't do anything, that means it accelerates gently and decelerates gently. Kind of imagine you're in a car, right? You're going to accelerate gently, hopefully, and then you're going to slowly come to a stop, right? Now we can also say, I don't want to do any of that smooth type stuff. I want to just change it to a very kind of linear acceleration curve. So a linear acceleration curve does not change. This one seems to be really jumpy. Yours might be a little smoother than this on your screen. I'm not sure why the performance on this one isn't all that good. It's supposed to be pretty decent. But that's pretty bad, actually. I'll try this on, I'll try this on another browser. See if it's a browser issue. Yeah, it does. It's a lot nicer on IE on this particular machine. Cool. So you have a. So you can control that. Let's say ease. I like ease in out. That's cool. Okay, so we can combine multiple transitions as well. So maybe there's more than just the position of something that I want to transform over time. Maybe I want to transform the scale, the rotation, the color, any of these things, right? I can certainly add them all up. So this is how this would work. So let's say height, width, nth of type 4. So where's my... Oh, that's not the one I want. Oh, combining transition. So this one right here. All right. So what we're going to do is here we're going to change the height and width of this. Width. So it's a little bigger. 300 px. Height. That's cool. And oh yeah. And let's set a different. We'll set a background color on this. Hot pink, so you can't miss it. Transform, rotate. And we'll set it to rotate 0 degrees. So just set the rotate up to be transformed on hover, right? So I've got 4 properties here that I'd like to change on mouse over or on hover for this H3. So what we do is then use the transition dash property, and I want to change the width, the height, and sorry, separated by commas. Width, height, background, you gotta spell it right, background dash color, and transform. Now I can also set these transitions to different durations, should I want to. So I can create a comma-separated list with timings that are separate for all of those visual properties. So I can say, well, change the width to over 1 second, change the height over 2 or 1.5 seconds, the background color over 2 seconds, and the transform over 3 seconds, for example. I'm exaggerating to make a point, but just so you know you have this granularity control. That's cool. So that's fine. Let's make sure here. So there's our element here. That's cool. And let's go ahead and change these properties now. Let's set the width to 400 px. Background color. Purple. And we'll set the transform. Rotate. And we'll rotate to, I don't know, 30 degrees. So all of this here, these are the properties of the element. These are the transition, the properties that will be transitioned should they change. And these are the timings for each of the corresponding width, height, background color, and transform. All of this should change, and they will all change on hover. They don't all have to change on hover, but they're sitting waiting in case they do change on hover. And of course, because this this element is position static, it remains in the document flow. So this is a really good way to visualize document flow. So because it's static, it takes up more space, so it pushes down any content below it. So if you're looking to you don't want that to happen, you don't want other pieces of content to bump around, then you need to change the position of this to absolute or relative or something like that. So it's no longer it's no longer in the document flow, right? Very cool. Which brings us to animation. So we have some other controls, and the amazing thing, I guess, about this is this is all CSS. None of this is being powered by JavaScript. It used to be. We used to have to put in standard and non-proprietary JavaScript, and it used to be you wanted to do this kind of level of interaction. It was horribly complicated to do, and it was unreliable across different browsing platforms. Well, the CSS implementation is pretty solid for all of this stuff, so that's really nice. And there's some argument about, well, this stuff really doesn't belong in CSS because the CSS is the visual presentation layer. This is interaction. This is logic, right? So you're going to find people in sometimes in either camp where they're going to say, no, this should be programmed using the logic layer. This should be in JavaScript. It shouldn't be in CSS. And other people say, well, yeah, but it's so simple and so easy just to put these properties there, and they might be visual motion properties, so they do belong in CSS, or it's just so much easier to do that, leave that to the CSS rendering engine, and the performance is arguably better anyway. So you're going to, you know what, that's up to you. I'll leave that decision up to you. You know, should I be building this interaction into my CSS, or should I be deferring that and building it into the JavaScript? A lot of the time, though, the JavaScript, all JavaScript's doing is adding and removing classes, and then you put this stuff in the CSS anyway. We found that sometimes there's a hybridized approach. People say, well, this logic should be in the JavaScript, but then the JavaScript's really only rewriting the CSS rules anyway, or adding and removing classes that apply CSS rules. So a lot of times the answer is, to some degree, it belongs in both places, right? I know that's not a very clear answer, but anyway, that aside, let's take a look at animations. So we're going to look at the footer, the paragraph in the footer. So here we go. Copyright silly putty incorporated. That's our paragraph inside the footer. Let's take a look at our markup just to make sure we know what we're talking about. Yes, there's a paragraph with fine print. So small is not a deprecated element. It means fine print now. We reassign it to have semantic meaning. So that's cool. We're going to animate that. How does that look? So we're going to build a keyframe powered animation. So there's two things. One is you put a lot of all the visual styles on the element itself that describe the characteristics of that animation, and then you build out the keyframes which contain the different visual properties that change at various points over time. So how does this play out? Well, I'll show you. So let's say we'll set the footer. P will say display. We'll change the display to inline block. Otherwise, I'll show you the difference here. This is important to see, particularly for what we're doing. So if I inspect this element, it's important to understand that this paragraph is with 100%, right? As all block level elements are, irrespective of how much content. When I say display inline block, it will be with auto, but also still behave as a block, taking its own line, forcing content to break. So for example, watch this. So I set just display inline block instead of display block. And if I reload the page, and then I take a look at this footer here, where is it? There you go. You'll see now the width is auto, right? That's the difference between inline block and block. Display block takes 100% of the width, unless you set a width on it otherwise. You still get all the benefits of block, but the content, the element shrink traps its content, which is sometimes very useful. Particularly for this, because I'm going to be sliding this around across the screen, right? So that's good. We can put, what else can we do? We can, I don't know, let's put background color on this, and I don't know, let's say light coral. All right, light coral, sure. That's fun. Let's put a padding on it. 0.5 font color, and let's put border. Let's put a border radius of 0.2 EMs. There you go. Now it's easy to see. Cool. I'll change that. Make that a little bit more round. Okay, so we'll bump up the font size. Let's say to rem. Let's say root M. So this is cool. If you're using root M, of course, that means it doesn't refer to the parent element. It actually goes right to the root and says, oh, so 100. There's the root. One EM is 150%. So multiply that by 2, so you get 300%, right? Oh, sorry, 200%. Double that is 2 root M, right? That's cool. Now let's get into the animation. So our animation settings. Okay, first we're gonna set this thing to just animate all the time. I'm not saying you should do this, right? I'm exaggerating and making things super cheesy to illustrate a point, just so you can understand the mechanics of this. This doesn't mean you go there and you build your production websites and have things flying around all of the time, right? Less is more, right? Animation and motion graphics should be used with great care and great restraint, right? And we talk, I'm sure your graphic design teachers have talked about restraint. That means just, pulling back, like don't go overboard. Be responsible with your colors, with your, we don't want to create what we call gratuitous animation, which is animation for animation's sake. That just makes end users mad, right? We've all been on web applications that like, really, seriously? What was it? I think I was on eBay. I was selling something on eBay the other day, and there's a little utility. You upload the pictures of the thing you want to sell, and so they put them in a little image gallery, and you can reorder them. So I said, okay, that's cool. And I moused over, and it changed the mouse pointer to the arrows, and I slid it. And when I changed it, they all started spinning around and rotating. I'm like, what the heck did I do? It was completely discombobulated, right? It was animation, but it wasn't cool. It was irritating, right? Use this with great care. Okay, I need to point that out. Okay, so let's set the animation duration. And we'll set this to 3 seconds for now. We'll do a 3-second animation. Now we need to give this animation a name. -name. So this, you can make this whatever you want. I'm going to call it slide capital in. Slide in. You can name that whatever you want. I think it has to be one string. I'm not sure if you. I think you have to restrict it to numbers and letters. You probably shouldn't start with a number, just like CSS IDs shouldn't start with a number. But other than that, you're free to name it what you want. Now this, and I'll come back to this in a second. The next thing is we say, well, how many times will this animation run through? Animation. You can see there the way we used to have to do it. We used to have to type things 4 times to get it to. You can only imagine how much CSS that was. It was awful. Not any longer. So animation iteration count. In this case, we want to say infinite. So basically, loop it. Okay. Animation direction. So you can do alternate or alternate reverse. Right? So you can have it alternate, so it goes one end of the keyframes and then goes backwards through the timeline. Right? Or you can go the other way, go backward through the timeline and then forward, right? So let's say alternate. We'll alternate back and forth through the keyframes that we've set up. That's cool. Now, I'll refresh the page, and that will do nothing. I've resized it. Okay. Doesn't do anything. So now I actually have to define the animation name slide in. I actually have to give that a name and define how it works. So what we do is down here we say at keyframes. Add a space, and then we say slide capital in. Open and close your braces. So this here associates itself with the name of the animation. So this is how we tie this element to the keyframes for the animation. So I can use a keyword to start from, or from. We'll say margin dash left. We'll change the margin left property, and we'll set it to 100%. So what's this saying is the margin of the left side is 100% of the page width. So it'll bump it all the way over to the right. Okay. Then we'll say halfway through, let's say 75% of the time, right? Now the time is 3 seconds. So this refers to 75% of 3 seconds. Whatever that plays out. At this point, we're going to say the font size. Let's change the font size to 3 rems instead of 2. I'll also do the margin left 25%. So 25% of the width of the page. And then I'm going to finish off with 2, or I could use 100%. And I could say margin left 0% of the page. I could add other keyframes in here as well. I could add 25%. So the idea is separating out these keyframes. Instead of hard coding seconds in here, I can plot them out and then I can change this value, right? And those keyframes will play out accordingly. I can stretch it, or right? So it kind of, it makes it a little bit more maintainable in a way, sort of. Save that. Reload your page. The performance isn't very good on this browser for whatever reason. Usually Chrome's pretty good. That's kind of weird. I'll pull it up here. It's the first time I've seen that. So there's it could be just the machine, yeah. Yep. On the browser?
No, here.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. My machine's starting to. I've got a performance. There's something going on my machine. Maybe there's some sort of update going on. Something's eating a lot of resources on my machine. Thin client, man. Let's get to thin clients. So there you go. And you can add in, you can add in keyframes here, like maybe, come on, give me my cursor back. Maybe want to say, oh wait, hold on. Yeah, there's something crazy going on with my machine right now. Let's say 25%. Let's say transform. Let's really overwhelm the thing. Transform. Let's really put the hammer down on this crazy thing.
Yeah, the machine costs next to much of
Yeah. Oh yeah, there'll be a lot of. Let's reload it. Whoa, there we go. Whoa. So, I mean, you can have all kinds of fun with that. The point of the matter is, though, that it's this is gratuitous animation. I'm obviously going overboard here, but to add subtle interactive effects, like maybe when a person slides over, maybe they slide over a chat window on the slide. You want the chat window to come out and kind of bounce like it's rubber, like kind of going, right, or kind of. It adds a bit of character to the interface, but don't overdo it, right? Think of it as just kind of really subtle kind of tweaks to the way to having things just appear and disappear, which are kind of gives it a very mechanical feeling. It adds just a little bit of life. We're gonna in the motion graphics for interaction class, we'll talk more about the subtleties of animation and the psychology behind that, and why you know, doing certain things like animation curves, easing in and out and that kind of thing, how that changes the feel of an application and why it's important, right? And then how do you add that practically to things like navigation panels, chat windows, picture elements, captions on pictures, things like that you'd often see, okay? So we'll take a breather, and then I'll introduce you to today's lab, which I'll let you kind of hack around with this stuff and have some fun with, and then we're done for the day. All right, so take a break. We'll come back in about 10, and I'll show. We'll get going on the lab. Okay, for the lab, probably most of you still are already chipping away at it, but for those on screen, watching the screencast, I'll refresh this page. So download, what I want you to do is open up the HTML provided, build out a CSS rotate, scale, skew, and translate on each of the P elements using the embedded CSS, so just use the CSS on the page. Create a rule for each of those above where the transform changes are on hover. Create a fifth element with a unique color, and then create a simple looping animation, make it different, of course, from the one we did. Build your own and make it interesting. Try some new effects. See what different properties you can animate using the keyframe, using a keyframe animation. Okay. And what does the code look like, or the? Okay, so do all of your CSS work just in the embedded style sheet, just so it's all self-contained. And there is your HTML. Okay. Cool. Bring the page to life. 2D CSS transforms.